Let's now solve together a real problem using the framework that we just learned about and also tools such as Google, StackOverflow, and MDN. And here is our very simple problem. So let's say that we work for a company that builds a smart home thermometer. And our most recent task is this. So given an array of temperatures of one day, calculate the temperature amplitude. And keep in mind that sometimes there might be a sensor error. And they give us this array of data. So what should we do here? How do we solve this problem? And this is actually a pretty simple problem, but it still shows us the fundamental logic of solving problems. Again, using the framework that I just showed you before. And so the two most important parts of that is to understand the problem and to breaking up the problem into smaller sub-problems. So let's start by understanding the problem a little bit better by asking some questions. So first of all, they want us to calculate the temperature amplitude. But what actually is that? So we can write that down here. What is temperature amplitude? And the answer to that is that it's the difference between the highest and the lowest temperatures in the array. So answer, difference between highest and lowest temp. And so this is the value that we will have to return from the function. Then we might ask, well, that's quite nice, but how do we actually calculate the highest and the lowest temperature in an array? So let's write that question. So how to compute the max and min temperatures. And finally, they also tell us here that sometimes there might be a sensor error. So what does a sensor error look like? So what's a sensor error and what to do when one occurs? And here the answer is probably to just ignore the error. Now here from our data, we can actually see what an error looks like. So it's this string here, which says error, okay? But it's good to have an idea of all of these questions so that we now really understand the problem that we need to solve. And so I think with this here, we do have a pretty good idea. So now, given our understanding of the problem, let's try to break the problem up into smaller sub-problems. So first, we need to make it so that the sensor errors are actually ignored. So as I was saying, the answer to what to do here is to just ignore the sensor errors and simply work with the rest of the data. So how to ignore errors? Then another task is going to be find max value in temperature array. And then another task is to find the minimum value. And another task is going to be to subtract min from max and then return it. So subtracting min from max is of course the amplitude. And so that's what we need to return. And so all of these are simple steps, but it's good to have an idea of how we will solve this problem. And so that's why I wrote down every single step of the way here. So let's start writing a function. So although they don't tell us that we should write a function here, whenever we encounter a task like this, it's a good idea to write a function for it. So let's call this function calc temp amplitude. And so this function will receive an array of temperatures. So let's again just call that temps. And so now we are going to start to work on solving this problem. And let's start here with finding the maximum and the minimum value in this array. We can deal with the errors a little bit later. Now, probably we don't know yet how to do that based on what we just learned, right? I mean, we already have the tools for sure, but this requires a little bit of thinking. And if we don't know yet how to think about this kind of problems, it's a good idea to do some research. And so we will now use Google to research how we can find a maximum value in an array. And so that's what I meant when I said we should do some research and use Google whenever we need to. So what I like to do is to just write JavaScript and then be as descriptive as possible of what I want to achieve. So let's say get max value in array. And so don't be afraid to ask Google this kind of questions whenever you're stuck yourself. Now we get here a couple of replies, basically, but I'm interested in showing you Stack Overflow now. So Stack Overflow is a site of questions and answers, and most of the time someone already had the same question as we have. And so then they ask that question on Stack Overflow, and we can then go there and find a response. And this one here sounds good, right? Find the min-max elements of an array in JavaScript. So let's click on that one. But now here the problem is going to be that at this point, you will not understand most of the solutions. For example, this one here talks about prototypes. This one has like this weird apply and math. And so let's just scroll until one that we can better understand. This one has this weird dots that we will go into later. But here we actually have something that we can understand. So let's focus on this solution here. Okay. And usually the first solution is always the best one, or the first or the second. But in this case, we just scrolled a little bit more so that we can find a solution that we can implement with the tools that we already learned about. So what they're doing here is to start by defining the first element of the array as max. So in the beginning, they basically assume that the maximum value of the array is the first element. And then from here, they loop through the array or over the array. And in each iteration, here, they test if the current value is greater than the maximum value. And if it is, then the new maximum here becomes the current element in the array. Okay, does that sound like a good idea? Well, I think that it does. So let's try to implement this ourselves, and then I will try to explain you a little bit better why this is a good solution. So let's create a for loop here. And of course, we don't need to copy the code here from this site. Usually it's best to understand the solutions and then trying to implement it on yourself. So not copying the code exactly from Stack Overflow. So let's start with the counter I. Let's start at 0 as always, even though here they're starting at 1. But never mind, we will just do it like we have always been doing it. So I must stay below the length of the array that we're looping over. And in this case, that's the temperature array, right? So temps dot length and then I plus plus. Okay. And actually, before we do the loop, we need to create that max variable that they have here. So let's do that. Let max equal the temps array. So the very first element. So again, we will start by assuming that the first element of the array is the maximum. And that's because we didn't loop over the array yet at this point. So this is similar to the challenge in the last section, where we started out with a sum set to 0. So that was a good starter value. And in this case, a good starting point is simply the first value of the array. And now let's implement that logic here. So if the current value of the array, so that's temps at position I, so the current position is greater than the current maximum value, then the maximum value will become this new value. And that makes sense. right? Because if the current value in the array is greater than the maximum, well, then that value should be the maximum, right? And so that's what we then do here. Okay, and now let's simply log it to the console. And remember that from now on, I will start using the snippet that we defined in the first lecture of the section. So I just type CL, hit return, and then max. Okay, and now just to test this function, let's call it with an array of just some values. So 3, 7, and 4. And so now it's very obvious what the result should be. And so I already saved it, and so probably we now already have the result here in the console, because remember, we still have the live server here running. And so it automatically reloaded the page, and we get the correct result here, which is that 7 is the max value. Let's add something else here, like 23. And now 23 will become the max value. And so the logic here works. So let's get rid of this one, and just to analyze what happens. So in the beginning, before we even start the loop, the max will be the first element of the array, so 3. Okay? Then the loop starts at the first position. So that's 3. So here, then we ask, is 3 greater than 3? No, it's not. So nothing happens. Then in the next iteration of the loop, we are at 7. So then the question is 7 greater than 3, which is the current maximum? And yes, it is. And so now max equals 7. Okay, next iteration of the loop, which is 4. And so the question is 4 greater than 7, which is the current maximum? No, it's not. And so nothing happens, and then we're done. And so the result in the end is that max is equal to 7. All right? Does that make sense? So we solved this problem here, so this sub-problem, where we found the max value. But now we need to do the same for the minimum. And hopefully you can see how that one works, because it's pretty much in the same way. So let's say min, and we will start at the same starting point here. And all we need to do now is to add another line to this loop. So we can do it all in one go. And so now what we're going to say is if the current temperature is less than the minimum, then that should become the new minimum. So min equals the current temperature. And actually, since we're using this here so many times, let's create a variable for that. So const current temperature is equal to temps at position I. And now I'm selecting and then Command D or Control D, 1, 2, 3, 4, and replace all of this with cur temp. Okay, and now just to see again if it works, let's log the minimum as well. And let's add some other value here. And so what can we expect when we save it? Well, the max should be 8 and the min should be 1. So I'm saving, and yes, that works. Next up, we can then tackle the problem of ignoring errors. So what that means is that we do not want to include this, right? Or in other words, this logic here should only run if we actually have a number here. Okay, so basically if the current element is a number, only then it makes sense to make this sort of comparisons. And so we can use something that we learned in the last section, which is the continue keyword. So let's say if the type of the current temperature, so type of current temperature is different from a number, then continue. And remember that continue means that the rest of the iteration will not be executed. So the current iteration will be finished and then it moves on right to the next one. And so in this case, what happens is as soon as the loop reaches this part here, since it's not a number, then none of the logic down here is executed, and then we move on to number 9 right away. Okay, so let's now actually call calc temp amplitude using our temperatures array. And indeed, we already have here the max and min temperatures. So let's confirm that that's correct. And yes, 7 is the max and -6 is the minimum. Awesome. So that works. Now there's only the easy part left, which is to return the amplitude. So return the max minus the min. Okay, let's get rid of this one here. And here, let's store that result into a variable, or actually amplitude. Okay, and then console log oh, actually there's an error here. This should be called amplitude. Okay, and so 23. So you can probably start to see that this is my favorite number, and so it comes up all the time here. Awesome. We did a great job here in solving this problem. And again, we did it because we first understood it correctly, and then we broke it up into these sub-problems. But now let's suppose that after we're done with our solution, the project manager tells us that the function should actually receive 2 arrays of temperatures and not just 1. But the rest of the function should work just the same. Okay, so, well, let's quickly write that problem down here. So problem 2, function should now receive 2 arrays of temperatures. So let's try to again understand the problem. So we can probably ask the question, when we have 2 arrays, do we need to implement the same functionality twice? And well, the answer is actually no. So the solution is to just merge the 2 arrays at the beginning. So just merge 2 arrays. And now we need to then again break this one up into sub-problems. And in this case, that's just, well, really just one sub-problem, which is how to merge 2 arrays. Okay, but we can see that this is probably the best thing to do, right? So imagine that we have this same function, but instead of receiving this one here, so just one array, it gets 2. Then if we can merge these 2 arrays into one, then the rest of the logic could stay exactly the same. Okay, and here the problem should actually be just merge 2 arrays. So that is our sub-problem that we will now solve. So let's now do some more research here. So I think we could actually come up with our own solution here, but really I just want in this lecture to use the tools that we have to solve problems on our own with research. So I want to show you how a developer goes about doing these things. So JavaScript merge 2 arrays. So we have here the Mozilla developer network that I told you about in the last lecture. And here we also have, again, a StackOverflow reply. So let's take a look at the StackOverflow again. So here we see that apparently there is like a concat method. So here we can also see array.concat. So that seems to be the solution. And I remember that previously on that Google results page, there was also something about that. So this first here, so the MDN page, is also about the concat method. So let's now actually explore the MDN website a little bit, okay? And let's make this a bit wider so I can show you how it really looks like. And so MDN looks like this. And once more, it might have changed by the time you're watching this video, but the core functionality will still be there. So there's always a short description about the functionality and then some quick examples. Then here on the left side, we can actually see all the methods about the array. Okay, and that's because we are right now on the page about an array method. So concat is a method of arrays, so similar to push or shift or includes, right? So concat is just one more of these methods. And again, we can see all of the methods here. And as I told you, there are a lot of them. So push, for example, is the one that we already learned about and used. So we can quickly see that. And so indeed, the push method adds 0 or more elements to the end of an array and returns the new length of the array. So this is kind of what we did ourselves previously. And actually, we can add multiple elements, which I didn't tell you by the time, but this here works just as well. But anyway, this was just to show you a familiar method. But let's return to concat here. So here is a long description of the method. Here is the exact syntax, which many times looks a bit intimidating. And so I like to actually stick to the examples here. So whenever you need to know how a certain built-in method or function works in JavaScript, you can always just look it up on MDN. This is really the complete but unofficial JavaScript documentation. And in fact, many of the things that I know about JavaScript come here from MDN. So don't be afraid of doing any research that you need on this page or also on Stack Overflow. Anyway, here from this example, we can understand kind of how the concat method works. So we have array 1 and 2, and then on array 1, we can call the concat method and as an argument pass in the second array. And the result will be array 3. And when we log that to the console, we will get A, B, C, D, E, F. And so that's the array 1, A, B, C, and then followed by array 2, essentially D, E, F. So I will just copy this syntax now and make this smaller again. And I will paste it here, just so we can then use it as a reference. Okay, and now I will get this whole function and not change that one, but instead create a new one. So calc temp amplitude new, and then here we also call the new one and call amplitude new. Okay, amplitude new. And now here we need to change the arguments. So remember that now this new function will receive 2 arrays of temperatures. So I'm just going to call them T1 and T2. Here at the beginning of the function is where we will solve our problem. So this subproblem of merging the 2 arrays. So let's again just put this here just so that we see it as a reference exactly where we need it. So what we want to do is to create a new array, and I will call it temps. And I'm calling it temps because that's the name of the complete array that we already have here in the function. So that used to be the name of the argument of the previous version of this function. And now I can just say the array 1, so array 1, which in our case is T1, dot, and then array number 2, which in our case is T2. And that's it. And now let's just log that to the console very quick. Temps, and we no longer need this. Okay. And here then we need to call this new function with 2 arrays. So let's just create 2 arrays. So 3, 5, and 1. And then another one, 9, 0, and 5. And now let's see. And here we see that it did actually work. So now we get this one array, which includes all the elements basically of these 2 arrays that we passed into calc temp amplitude new. So this function. And we can also see that 9 and 0 are the max and the min, and 9 minus 0 gives 9, which is then this new amplitude new. Awesome. So we solved this problem number 2 here successfully as well now. And yeah, so I hope that now you have a better idea of how to solve problems, and especially how to do research using the tools that I just showed you in this video. So that's Google, StackOverflow, and also the MDN documentation. And this last one is, in my opinion, actually the most important one. I learned so much from MDN. It's incredible. So now in the future, whenever something is not working in your code, and even during the course, you can always try to figure out the solution on your own, for example, using Google or StackOverflow. And so that will then be very helpful for your developer journey.